Hi there. Today we're going to talk about absolute values and how they apply to inequalities. And let's just remember what an absolute value means. The absolute value of x means x if x is greater than or equal to 0, and minus x if x is less than 0. This always confuses students at first. This expression, let's highlight it. This expression here, minus x, most students are going to look at that and say, oh, that's negative. But think about it. If x is negative, minus x is positive, right? If you have minus 5, and then you make it be negative, in other words, you put a negative sign out in front of it. So here, x is negative 5, and I put a negative sign in front of it. I know that that equals 5. And so really what we know about absolute value is that the absolute value of a positive number will always be just itself, and the absolute value of anything negative just becomes the positive value. So absolute value is always greater than or equal to 0. It is true that the absolute value of 0 is 0. So I think that's probably stuff that you've already known. So let's look at some examples with absolute value as they apply to inequalities. So for example, suppose I ask, when is the absolute value of x less than 2? All right, so the solution there is x has to be less than 2, but greater than minus 2. In other words, all the numbers whose absolute value is less than 2 lie right in that interval. And if we ask, where is the absolute value of x greater than or equal to 3, well, where are the numbers whose absolute value is greater than or equal to 3? Let's draw it first. Right? So one place where absolute value can be greater than or equal to 3 is there, and the other place is there. So what this means is that this translates to x is less than or equal to minus 3. What's the word here? And or. It could be either one, so it's an or. X is greater than or equal to 3. Okay, so what we see is that this statement translates here, and this statement translates there. In other words, here's how I rewrite that without using absolute value, and the same thing here. So this is a typical example of an inequality involving absolute value. And if you recall what we just said, there are two ways that the absolute value of something can be greater than or equal to 12. One way is for 4x minus 7 to be less than or equal to minus 12, or 4x minus 7 can be greater than or equal to 12. And so we want to solve each of these equations, each of these inequalities. That's a common mistake. So if I solve the left side, I'm going to get x is less than or equal to minus 5 over 4, or if I solve the right side, I get x is greater than or equal to 19 over 4. And so if I graph that, here's 0, here's minus 5 over 4, here's 19 over 4, less than or equal to minus 5/4, greater than or equal to 19/4. Okay, so take a look at that, make sure you follow it, and then we'll move on. Okay, so here's a problem which is a step up in difficulty. And so let's go through each of the steps in solving this. So what I'll do first is I'll add 5 to each side. And that gives me minus 2 times the absolute value of x plus 2 is less than or equal to minus 6. So what I want to do now is multiply both sides by Can you see it? Minus 1/2. And that'll get rid of the minus 2 here. So if I do that, I get the absolute value of x plus 2. Over here I get 3, but since I multiplied by a negative number, the direction changes. And so what this means is x plus 2 is greater than or equal to 3. And we know that that means that either x plus 2 is less than or equal to minus 3, or x plus 2 is greater than or equal to 3. And so if I solve this, I get x is less than or equal to minus 5, or x is greater than or equal to 1. And if I graph it, here's a 1, here's a minus 5, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. And that's what my solution is. Any number that is either here or here will make this statement be true. Right? So here's our first tricky problem. And what I would like you to do is press pause when you get a second, and then try to go through this and solve it on your own and see what the problem is. Okay, so if I were to take this and solve it a little bit, I would eventually come down to this statement. Absolute value of 3x plus 4 is less than minus 2. And now you have to think a little bit. Because how can the absolute value of anything be less than minus 2? All numbers less than minus 2 are negative. So there's no way that this can be true. And so our answer here is no solution. And that can happen, and it's a legitimate answer, and you have to be on your toes for that. Absolute value can never, ever be negative. All right? And that's it for Chapter 3.